Mr. Chair, and thank you all who are here. Thanks to the organizers, but a special thanks to all of you who hung with us through the day. I don't have to tell anyone in this room that we're gathered at a challenging moment. In fact, if there were a common theme to the presentations of the day, that might be it. It is, of course, the case that the climate change challenge has been fully chronicled already, but I want to simply add to the mix of concerns the work on planetary boundaries done by Johan Rockström, done by Professor Catherine Richardson at the University of Copenhagen and others, which highlights that in addition to the climate challenge, 6 of the 9 critical Earth systems, 7 or 8 of which are beyond the climate system, are also being breached or at risk of being breached. So we really do need to think about this as not just a climate resilience challenge, but as a sustainable future challenge. And in that regard, I want to turn us from the science foundations to that challenge to the policy responses, centered as this session is meant to on what's required for an energy transition that delivers us to a future that we need. And in that regard, I want to set the discussion in what I call the broader context of 21st century thinking and what I sometimes refer to as the sustainability imperative. Now, before I try to unpack what that means, I want to take you back to one of the most important lessons I learned as a young official at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in the run-up to the Rio Earth Summit of 1992. And for those who attend the regular gatherings, the annual climate change summit meetings, those COP meetings as we've come to call them, this would count as COP 0, from which we count up to 28. And the Secretary General of that gathering, that original 1992 UN Conference on Environment and Development, was a great Canadian diplomat businessman named Morris Strong. And I remember sitting with him as we waited to go in and talk to the EPA administrator in March of 1992, a month before the last of the climate change negotiations, just a couple of months before the gathering in Rio. And I asked Mr. Strong what he was thinking. How did he think things were going as we headed for Rio? And he said to me something I've never forgotten. He said, Dan, when you bring 115, turned out to be 120 presidents and prime ministers together with all their cabinet members, thousands of media representatives, and what turned out to be the largest NGO gathering in history up to that moment, tens of thousands of NGOs, he said there's only 2 outcomes: success and real success. And I put success in air quotes because we've had far too much success in the 30 years intervening. And so the question I want to ask today is, what does it take to deliver real success? And I think we can start by saying that there's some clarity beginning to improve our vision. And I want to go to what came out of COP28 in Dubai in December. Again, a number of you were there. There was a lot of discussion of the commitment to transition away from fossil fuels. I honestly don't think that was such big news. That has been said in other ways and other times over many years. There was a lot of celebration around the loss and damage agreement, which I actually think was important as a signal of a commitment of fairness to those that may be the victims of climate change. And I celebrate the political thoughtfulness of shifting toward a forward-looking structure of support and away from a backward-looking structure of liability that would never have been agreed upon. So that is political creativity and good policymaking on display. But the real challenge, the real demonstration, I think, of the meaningful outcome from that COP was the outcome of the global stocktake, the exploration of what, when you add up all the national efforts at climate change, the so-called nationally determined contributions to climate change action, what do you get? And the answer was emissions still going up, not going down. And even where they're coming down, and there's a number of countries where they're coming down, as we already heard, including my own, but in very few countries are they coming down fast enough to get us to a net zero emissions future by 2050. And indeed, the team at Yale that I lead that does the biennial Environmental Performance Index is suggesting that only one country, and I won't make you guess, is on track, at least at this point, to a net zero position in 2050, and it is Denmark. And even they are not clearly going to be able to hold on to their trajectory at the current moment. So then the question is, what do we do differently to meet the moment? How do we structure policy to deliver transformative change? And I really do want to put a question to all of you. What's your theory of change? And we've heard some today, and I do think all of them have a part to play. But I think the fundamental piece of this is the energy transition. And so I want to bear down on that with you. What is it going to take to get us to the vision of the 2015 Paris Agreement and the more specific target of the 2021 Glasgow Climate Pact? Again, net zero greenhouse gas emissions by mid-century. And I think the fundamental challenge is getting us to not just a clean and renewable energy future, but in the spirit of this gathering, one that is affordable and accessible to all. And that is not a simple thing. We really do need to build out this clean energy infrastructure across all nations, all communities, at speed and scale. So I want to highlight 5 elements, 5 policy elements that I think are fundamental to this. First is, and this has not been attended to as much today as I would have thought, innovation. We fundamentally need innovation, and not just technology innovation, but new ways to engage the public, new mechanisms of finance, new policy structures. So a broad structure of innovation is fundamental. I think we also need, and we've heard it already a bit, and perhaps we'll get into this more in the coming couple of days, finance. We need to ensure that all nations and all communities can move together to this clean, renewable, and affordable clean energy future. And that does mean scaled up commitments of capital, especially going to the global south. It's going to require blended finance, as we call it, mix of public resources and private capital through creative tools like green banks, green bonds, and other similar structures. And Governor Healy gave us one example that she's working on in Massachusetts. And I do think we need to remember that clean, renewable, and affordable energy is what economists might call a mixed good. So it has elements that are a public good because it's trying to do something different and we need to pay for the increment that is clean and affordable. But it is also a private good. It can be sold. Electricity has a price. So we need to think about how to structure these blended finance systems to do what we need to get done. And I do think it means we need a fundamentally new role for the World Bank and the other multilateral development banks, for the IMF, in parallel with private capital. So I'm a big believer that the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero, launched by Mark Carney in Glasgow, has got a role to play. Now something like 400 private financial institutions committing, although some are backing away, but committing to do their lending in alignment with a net zero future. But beyond this, I think we need as well broader business engagement. I actually think that corporate sustainability is the fundamental step towards a truly sustainable future. And so I don't want to put anyone in this room in an awkward place, including particularly the elected officials. But it turns out that the really important decisions are made by the folks that have their hands on the steering wheel of the corporate world. These are the folks that decide what gets built, how it gets built. Government can shape the road that they drive on, but these are the folks that we really have to figure out how to transform their behavior. And in that regard, I do think we should particularly focus, as we have heard already today, on the countries, 20% that represent 80% or 90% of emissions, but also, perhaps even more importantly, on those biggest companies. We have a global GDP of just over 100 trillion US dollars, and more than half of that comes from the top 1,000 companies and their choices and their activities all around the globe. So I want to start today by saying the real key to transformation in my mind is a new ethical foundation for business. And I think we have to go beyond the teaching of management schools, and I teach in part in a management school of 50 years, which emphasized something called the Friedman Doctrine. And that was the suggestion that we should have as corporate leaders a mission of maximizing profitability. Sometimes this is called the shareholder primacy doctrine. We should maximize profitability up to the limits of the law. But I have to tell you as a lawyer that the law is a net, not a wall. And there's too much ease with which companies can reach through that net and pull in profits and have private gain at public expense. And that's what I think we have to bring an end to. So I think we need a new core principle of stakeholder responsibility, where companies accept that they have a duty of care, of course, to their owners, but to their suppliers, their customers, their workers, their communities, their states or provinces, and society more broadly. So again, the fundamental principle, no private gain at public expense. This, by the way, echoes what some of you in this room will know very well as the polluter pays principle that's been discussed in environmental policy for decades and is reflected in dozens of international agreements, or what economists would call the need to end uninternalized negative externalities. And by the way, this doesn't mean the end of pollution. It means you choose whether to stop your pollution or pay for the harm you're causing. So it's really about making people accountable for the harm they cause. And in this august setting, I want to offer what I think is the foundation of this principle. So it's not really a new principle, it's the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's fundamental to all the world's major religions, and it's certainly the animating spirit of Pope Francis's Laudato Si papal encyclical. And this leads to the question I think we really need to dig into: how do we move business toward a sustainable future? How do we make sure that companies can't profit by spilling harm onto others in any form? Pollution up a smokestack, effluent out a pipe into a river, emissions into the atmosphere. All of that should be seen as unacceptable in the 21st century going forward. So then you might ask, Dan, what's your theory of change? You're challenging everybody else. My theory of change is we need to find a structure of rules that hold business accountable. And I think, having spent 30 years thinking about this, the answer is the international trade system. Now, you might say that reflects the fact I've been on public service leave from Yale for the last 2 years, working in Geneva at the World Trade Organization. And that's true. And I have had the inspiration of enormously hard-charging, energetic leader of the WTO, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. And I do think she is the right person to lead what could be a transformative change to deliver on this promise. And I think what we want, and we heard a little bit earlier with David's discussion about agriculture, is we want a World Trade Organization remade to really deliver on this. Trade, we all know, can help move at speed and scale the technologies, projects, services that we need for a sustainable energy future to all corners of the globe at ever lower costs. But what we really need is a trade system that can provide the discipline to ensure corporate accountability, corporate sustainability. And for those who are interested, I worked in parallel with my time at the WTO with a network of academics on something we call the Villar Framework for a Sustainable Trade System, laying out what a really, truly remade trade system might look like. One with new economic underpinning, beyond the market fundamentalism, the neoliberalism of recent days. And again, if anyone has really pushed that agenda, Pope Francis gets credit for the need for a new economic foundation for not just global commerce, but local commerce. And we do need sustainability standards for business activity. We do need consistency with the WTO's original mission, launched at the time it was created in 1995 in an agreement called the Marrakesh Agreement, which says, and I'm paraphrasing, the purpose of the trade system is not open markets, trade liberalization, it's sustainable development. And I do think we need to push towards that with new rules on subsidies, as David told us, a restructured commitment to developing countries. And let me close then with what I think is really the fundamental issue here, is how do we do this transition in a way that is fair? And I do think a just transition needs to be thought about carefully, and I want to give you very quickly 6 dimensions of what I think that fairness requires. First is participation, inclusion particularly of historically marginalized communities. So we need broad participation. We need to protect the poor. Low-income families cannot bear a disproportionate burden of the transition. We need help for and transition assistance to the old economy workers. And this is not just a matter of fairness, it's a matter of political necessity. We're not going to get past, as Arunaba and several others told us, the challenge of those who are going to be burdened by these changes, especially farmers, but also fossil fuel communities. We also need to help frontline communities, those who will bear the cost of change as they try to invest in new ways of doing things, but in particular, those burdened by inaction. And if we heard anything today, and that is that there is a huge threat if we don't take up the issue. And the burden of inaction falls very heavily on the developing world. So my last 2 dimensions are international equity. How do we share the burden? We heard about common but differentiated responsibility, But please remember the name of the Pope's encyclical, On Care of Our Common Home. And that really does emphasize commonality over our differences. The last element is intergenerational fairness, which we did hear some about already. And I do think it means we need to be very careful as we push forward to think about country-to-country fairness, and also not just climate change attention, but also biodiversity, the other great existential threat. We need a nature-positive agenda. We need regenerative agriculture and sustainable food systems. So all of that argues that we've got a lot to do across many vectors, global, national, subnational, provincial, and local. We need a special focus on corporate behavior and a new structure of incentives to change how businesses operate. We do need revitalized global governance across the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO. And I think together, we really can bear down on what's required for real success. Thank you very much.